Welcome to Little Notes and Big Questions. I'm Lindsay Schreiber. In this series, we are looking at social issues through the lens of biblical truth. We're developing an apologetic, or a defense of what we believe in light of the scriptures. In this video, we're going to be discussing the subject of furries, Therians, and Otherkin. I want to give a couple of disclaimers before we get started and let you know how this video is going to be a little bit different. Last night, we had our in-person class, and it was a phenomenal class because we heard from our young people who are experiencing some of these ideas in their schools, and we got to hear from our adults who, most of them had no clue the depth of some of these things we're going to talk about. But because the conversation went so long, I wasn't able to get to the second half of the class, and so to stay together, I'm going to present this video in two parts as well. This video is going to serve to pull back the curtain on exactly what is happening in these communities with these ideologies. This was a topic that the young people of our church asked me to study out specifically. Next week, I'll share part 2, which will be the biblical response to these issues. I want to say this from the beginning. Whenever I take on a new topic, whether it's my personal study or for me to present in these Little Notes on Big Questions videos, I work really hard at going to the most reputable sources possible. If I'm going to talk about a certain community, I try to go to what appears to be the official or unofficial voice of that community. I want to hear what they say about themselves, not just what their critics say about them, because I want to be able to answer real questions that come out of conversations, things that people really do need to understand about God's Word. Well, that was almost impossible on these subjects because what I have found is that the things we're going to talk about today have really been birthed in and grown up in the internet, the wild west of the internet. And so what we are finding is that most of this information just kind of comes about through the way it moves through online communities, Reddit threads, TikToks, YouTube, those kind of things. That's where we find it. So I want you to know from the beginning, I've done my very best in this research to bring you the most truthful and clear depiction of the concepts I'm going to talk about. But I also want you to understand that it is entirely possible because we're also dealing with people for whom there is no reality and there is no truth. Words can change, definitions can change, but I'm going to present to you the best that I was able to piece together from my research. These topics are so different that there actually came a couple points where I thought, what if they're just like punking us? Like, what if some of this stuff that I'm reading in these websites, they're all just out here to throw the adults off and then they can mock us because we don't understand? Well, for one thing, I don't think that's the case. I think the people who develop this stuff really believe it. And for another, it doesn't actually matter because if these things weren't real, the problem is that our kids and your grandkids are still on the internet seeing it. And if they think it's real, they'll think these are viable options. That's why I think it's important for the church to engage in this conversation and to understand it. We have a tendency when we think something is odd or we think something has no merit to say, well, I don't need to understand what's happening there. It doesn't affect me because it's weird. That's how we view it. But it does affect you. It affects you because we have young people who are hearing these things and they think they're true. And we have to be the watchmen on the wall paying attention. Something similar came up in our conversation about the LGBTQIA+ community. And I told you that while the church was mocking all the letters and saying, well, I can't keep up with all the letters, so I've tried, they didn't realize that an agenda that was targeting children changed the letters so that every child, once they were introduced to these gender theory concepts at 3 or 4 years old, every single one of them would fall under that banner, and that was the purpose. And I see something very similar in the communities we're going to talk about today. It is my belief, after having done this research, that this is a trick of the devil that goes after the vulnerable populations among us. And that's why we, the mature Christians, need to be aware, standing on guard, and we need to have an answer. It's a scriptural command, and it's been our guiding scripture throughout this apologetic series, that we must be ready to stand with a defense. We have to know what's going on, and we have to know what God's Word says, more importantly, so that we can stand when we have questions, and hopefully we can help some people to pull back that mask, that delusion that's over their minds. We're going to start off with our biblical stance, and it is this: God designed mankind as a soul-body unity. To label the soul as anything other than human is to deny the infallibility of God. The person making this claim of a soul disjointed from the body is inadvertently demeaning their intrinsic value as a person made in the image of God. We're going to start off with some definitions. And like I said, on this video, I'm pretty much pulling back the curtain to help you have some understanding. We'll go into the scriptures next week to explain what are our answers back to this. The first subject we're going to talk about is furries. Furries are individuals who they get excited about dressing up like an animal. Their goal is to anthropomorphize animals. That just means to give human characteristics to an animal. If you've ever watched a cartoon, you have experienced what anthropomorphizing looks like. Bugs Bunny used to hold his carrot like a cigar and lean up against a wall. I've never seen a real rabbit do that. That was giving human characteristics to an animal. Well, they kind of do that in the furry community. They're dressing up in these costumes. Sometimes it could just be maybe ears of an animal or like paws or a tail. And then sometimes they have full outfits. Those are called fursuits. And when people wear their fursuits, which looks like the mascots you might see at a high school football game, they engage in their fursona, their persona as this animal. These people don't so much, in general, they don't think that they are that animal. They don't think they have that animal soul. But it's more like dress up. It's role playing, and it's to them just something fun to do. There has been conversation that really the idea of furries owes a lot to the Star Trek conventions. If you've ever seen those, or maybe you went to one, I guess in the 70s it would have been, when people would dress up like Trekkies, they would go to these conventions, and you were just around like-minded people, and it was this fun experience. Similar to today when people go to Comic-Con and they dress up as different superheroes. And not a lot is thought about that. You may have heard of adults cosplaying is a word that is used often. It's basically just adults dressing up like characters that they like for a fun day or for a fun experience. They enjoy dressing up. They don't generally actually think that they are from Star Trek. People don't usually think that they are Captain America or the Hulk or whomever they dress up as. In that sense, this is very different from everything else we're going to talk about. And I want to be clear on this point because sometimes the words are all used synonymously, and that's not really the way that it should be. Obviously, we probably all know children who have pretended, young children who'll crawl around and they'll act like a dog or a cat or whatever, but they generally don't think they're that. It's just a moment of play. The furry community is trying to say that it's the same thing if you are an adult doing that. And I think they've happened upon a good argument. I'm going to give them that I can easily see how they equate that back to people going to Comic-Con and things like that. I think the difference is, however, there has to come a point where the playtime ends. And I think a difference is definitely made between a situation where you've dressed up in costume or something like that is very different than someone who's made it a real lifestyle and they've made it their identity. I don't know people who go to Comic-Con or those kind of things, but then they also just randomly dress that way and also just like to engage in that sort of pretend play as an adult. That seems different to me. I want to point out something really important that I hope parents understand about the Wild West internet. As I was researching these topics, and I've been researching a lot over the last few months as I was preparing to teach on these subjects, especially transgenderism, and on this topic, I've had to do a lot of research and watch a lot of videos that I really didn't feel like watching. But I've been trying to do that because I want to have a better understanding that I can bring to you. Basically, I'm going to suffer through it and then try to give you the Cliff's Notes version so you don't have to. But there's something really interesting that's happened in the furry community. I did happen upon some actual research, actual psychological research and studies about these communities. And something that was interesting I found is that adult furries are pretty dismayed and discouraged because there's this rise of children who want to make these masks and wear the mask and wear gloves and wear the tails and all that stuff, but they don't want to call themselves furry. So like teenagers who are engaging in this kind of imaginary play don't want to call themselves furries because furry had a sexual connotation, and they earned that sexual connotation because that's most definitely a fetish that is just a truth, that is truly a part of that community. And so for a long time, the words were just sort of synonymous, furry and fetish, that it was all sexualized. So now you have these teenagers who are growing up and they're saying, it's not a sexual thing, I'm just pretending, I'm just playing. But the adults in the furry community, they need those younger people to also call themselves furry because it grows the community. And so they're trying to work to really change the image. But here's the problem. There are a lot of TikTok accounts and YouTube channels where you will find men in their 30s and their 40s dressed like animals, and the whole point of their videos is to say to kids, your parents don't understand you, I understand you. I'll call you what you want to be called. I will play along with this. I can give you point of view content, which was something actually a young person in our class brought up last night, watching POV YouTube videos where a video will take you perhaps through a home as if you were a cat moving through, where they're now immersing themselves in these things. Well, these videos of these adults dressed like this, to me, it is the modern day stranger in the van offering you candy. They're welcoming these kids in, saying, trust me, don't trust your parents. That is grooming, period. I don't know what their end plan is. I've got a pretty good idea, but I don't know, and I'm not accusing. But I am saying that parents need to be on guard that the internet is a very scary place. And that's what you're going to keep hearing me say throughout this video, is that the internet is very concerning. Obviously, there are positives. That's how I'm able to talk to you today. But there's not regulation. And the places these kids are going and getting this information is full of terrifying people who are after your kids. I'm not being an alarmist, but if it takes an alarm to wake you up, that's what I'm going to do. Because these kids are getting dragged into this stuff that as we progress, you're going to find becomes more and more dangerous. Dangerous not even on a moral level, just dangerous to society. And you're going to see some spiritual aspects that will pop up here in just a minute. And you'll understand why I'm trying to ring the alarm at the very beginning, that there has to be an understanding with children that at some point, play is done, we're putting that aside, we're moving forward. You can't continue in this vein of play. It's going to have to come to a stop or to a pause. If it's a child, at least a pause. And if they can't do that, there may be some questions to start asking. But in general, what I want you to know about furries as we move on is that they enjoy dressing up, but they don't really think they're an animal. They don't really think that their soul or their inside is that creature that they're portraying. They just want to play as that animal. That's very different from ultra-humans. Ultra-humans are members of the non-human community, is what they would say. This is their identity. This identity includes things like otherkin, vampires, and systems. And I'm going to explain systems later on. That's a really important one. There are a potentially infinite number of these identities. These people can also identify as or with someone or something that is from or is connected to a place other than this earth. So basically, anything you can think of that is not a human being, these are people who say that their inside or their soul is that, just something non-human. The most well-known type of ultra-human is known as Therians. You may have heard it pronounced Therian. This identity is known as Therianthropy. It is a modern, non-clinical identity where an individual feels that their internal identity is, in part or entirely, a non-human animal known as their theriotype. I want to make a quick note about this word animal in this definition. That could mean an animal like a pet in your house or like an animal at the zoo, but it is a more general term. It could include mystical and mythical creatures like dragons and fairies and stuff like that. Just something non-human is all they're really going for in that definition. I also want to make it really clear right here, you could have two people in front of you dressed like cats, crawling on the ground, meowing, the whole nine. And one of them be classified a furry and one be classified a Therian. And you would only know that when you asked them. So the one who says that they are furry, according to these people at least, the one who says that they are a furry would say, I know I'm not a cat, I'm just dressed like one, and I'm just pretending to be one, but I know I'm not actually a cat. The other one, the Therian, would say, oh yes, I'm a cat. My soul's a cat. My identity is as a cat. This is how I engage with the world. That's the difference. It comes down to their identity. The word in this definition of non-clinical is really important. The reason it's important is because people who think we should affirm this sort of lifestyle, they would say being a Therian is an identity. It is not a diagnosis. It's not a mental disorder. Well, they have to use that non-clinical differentiation because the same people who would give you the definition I just gave you about therianthropy, that is a non-clinical identity where someone feels that their internal identity is, at least in part, non-human, the same sites will also tell you and admit there is clinical therianthropy, which is a rare psychiatric condition where a person holds the delusional belief that they have transformed into an animal or in the process of transforming. This condition is associated with psychosis and altered states of mind, and it differs from non-clinical identity of being a Therian, which is a person who identifies as a partially non-human. That partial part is coming because they don't think their body is different, just the soul, what's on the inside. Symptoms include a belief of animal transformation, and the transformation appears to occur in the mind and behavior of the affected person. Is it just me, or is that like really splitting hairs? They are very, very similar. And from what I can tell, the difference becomes when someone actually thinks their body is physically changing. And until they think their body is actually physically changing, they're okay. But once they start to imagine that their body is changing, that they've now crossed this line into psychosis. Well, that's a really close line to me. I also think it's concerning, and this is part of my concern even in the furry world where they say they're just playing and it's just imagination and all that. Part of my concern is how long can you dress like something and act like something before it becomes your identity? Like, if you were forced to wear prison garb every day, eventually you're going to take that mind of a prisoner. Like, that's the way that it works. It's dehumanizing. And throughout history, we know that people have been mistreated when they were dehumanized, and now we're being told to support people who are dehumanizing themselves. It's a very concerning line, in my opinion, and some of the most blurry lines you could imagine. Last night was very interesting because some of our young people were commenting on these different topics, and I loved getting their input on it and the things they're experiencing in real time. And some even made remarks of, well, but I know people who will tell you, oh, I am this animal. I know I'm this animal. My soul is this animal. It is my identity, but I'm not clinically. I don't have a clinical problem. I don't have a diagnosis. I'm not diagnosed like that. No, this is normal. To which I would say most of the time when people have a psychiatric disorder, they are unaware that they have a problem. That's part of the thing, is that you're losing your rationale. You're losing your ability to think rationally, whether or not they want to label themselves as having a clinical psychological issue. They do, whether they see it or they recognize it or not. But that's another issue that happens on this slippery slope that we're on in our culture, where you are whatever you say you are. I told the church last night, it reminded me of these videos I watch on YouTube. I would like to watch police body cam videos. And you'll see these sovereign citizens, people who think the rules of law don't apply to them. And they will be out here accosting the police, screaming at the police. They'll start hitting the police, bashing police car windows. And then when the police officer finally arrests them, they start screaming, I don't consent to be arrested. I don't consent to be in handcuffs. It doesn't matter what you're consenting to, because it's what's happening. It's where we're at this point. To me, it's a similar mindset with these kids, where they think, well, if I say I'm not mentally in trouble, then I'm not mentally in trouble because it's my decision. No, it is not. It is a statement of fact that you now think something's happening to you that's not happening. I also think this is really interesting. The clinical definition is interesting because there's a phenomenon in the community called phantom limbs. And phantom limbs is when someone has bought this delusion so long that they are something else on the inside, that they begin to have these feelings that they are growing whatever's associated with their kin, which is the type of animal that they associate with. So like if you thought you were a dragon, you believe that long enough, you begin to have these phantom feelings as if you have wings, although you don't have any wings. But they can have that and have those sensations and still not be called the clinical therianthropy. But you said in your definition that these are people who think their body is undergoing transformation. To me, that would most definitely fall into that category. Also in the definition, it said if their behavior is affected. And we have all probably by now heard stories of young people who are making demands to be taken on walks as a dog, or demands of getting a litter box in a school, or whatever it is. Obviously, their behavior is being affected by their beliefs. So at that point, by this definition, you have crossed between it being an identity and now it being a psychosis. And I just have the feeling that you can only claim something as identity for so long before it does do something in the brain. I don't have the study to show you that. It just makes sense to me in watching human behavior. I also think this is really interesting because what they're basically saying in the clinical and non-clinical definitions is that if you say you're a non-human on the inside and that's your identity, that's perfectly normal and that's okay. It's only when you think you're becoming that non-human that it's psychotic. And I think that's weird because I have watched a lot of these kind of videos over these last few months doing this research where I've seen men, for instance, who have transitioned, biological men, born a man, and they've gone through surgeries to feminize their body. But they don't have a uterus. And these men, born men, their DNA is male, I have watched videos where they claim that because they've gone on hormones that they now have menstrual cycles and menstrual cramps. Because their stomach hurts and they assume that's a menstrual cramp because they have bought the delusion that they're a woman. You're not, that is not what this is. It can't be that. It can't be what you're saying it is. That is not possible because of the physiology of what happens that causes that pain in a woman. And also, you've never been a woman, so you don't know what the female experience is to know what to even compare it to. So it is nonsensical. So what is so weird to me is that the trans community can do that, and they can say, I don't have a uterus, but because I call myself a woman, I can feel the pains of a woman. And that is not addressed, and that's fine, and they can live in that, and we should all affirm it, and we should all go buy them medicine for their alleged menstrual cramps and support them in that. But gender dysphoria, it's in the DSM-5. It's still listed as a disorder in the clinical handbook for mental health practitioners, but we're not calling that a clinical issue. We're not saying they need to go to a psychiatrist because something's really wrong, but this community is doing that. It's a very interesting juxtaposition in this journey that we are on. How do we even get to this spot? Well, the best I can tell, modern day therianthropy, they're tracing it back to the early 90s when what were basically early chat rooms, I guess you would say, were set up where people would talk about, for instance, werewolf literature and movies and things like that. They start gathering people together with these like interests, and then they start saying, well, this literature or this movie about this werewolf is a really good analogy for what I feel. And then finally, somebody says, hey, let's stop saying it's an analogy. It's not an analogy, it's who we are. Let's just own who we are. And that's how we landed in this spot we're in now. And I bring that up because I want us to make it very clear to our young people especially, the internet is a scary place. I will continue to say it. There is not, they can talk about rules and regulations all they want. It's not regulated. They're letting anything go. And the problem with the internet is that anything you say, you can find somebody to agree with it, no matter how ridiculous it is. You can also stand on the righteous side and find people who have every problem with it. The internet is concerning because it's a rallying place for people with these really fringe ideas and even these psychotic issues where they can find each other and affirm one another. It's what started this, and it's what's keeping it going, and it's what our young people are getting dragged into even today. I want to go over a couple more things about Therians before we move on. The term originates from two Greek words, those being therion, meaning beast, and anthropos, meaning human. So the term loosely translates to animal, person. Therians often experience a profound psychological and emotional connection with their animal identities. This is one definition I found. They believe they are animals themselves. Stereotypes are defined as what a Therian identifies as on a spiritual or a personal level. So we're going to talk a little bit about stereotypes so that you can see what's happening, so that you can see they are literally making flags as rallying points for pretty much anything you can think of. I actually, in the class last night, I pulled up ChatGPT, I typed in, make a flag for my mermaid identity, and within about 30 seconds, I had a flag produced for me that I could use as my banner. And so I'm going to go over these because I want you to see pretty much anything you could think of to be your identity, somebody thinks they're that. And it gets really out there. But I want you to see it because there's a progression that happens, and we're back to what I said about all the letters in the LGBTQIA+, that when we just say this is silly, I can't imagine anybody really is engaging in this. The problem is that there are really serious concerns in this community, and if all you see is the odd ones at the beginning that just seem so out there, you'll never dig deeper to see the real sinister parts of this movement. There are theoretically endless numbers of identities, just the same way we talked about gender identity and orientation, how it just kind of goes on, and it's ever evolving, and every day the list is changing. It really is the same thing with these as well. So I've just picked a few of the ones that I found in research. When someone is animal-hearted or other-hearted, they have this strong internal connection to a specific non-human creature that influences their identity. People who are animal-hearted, they often will consider that animal type as a family. They probably they won't say that they are that, they don't identify as that, but it's like they're welcomed into it. I don't know that Carol Baskin ever called herself animal-hearted, but that was the picture in my head that I got, if you ever watched any of that around Tiger King. Otherkin is generally seen as a person who non-physically identifies as a non-earthen being. They often identify with mystical creatures or as, quote, anything that isn't living organic being on planet Earth. If you look at this flag, that star in the middle is the elvish, not like blue suede shoes, but elves, like in the forest, that's the elvish star. Now, when you get into Otherkin, then there are a million subtypes. And I'm just gonna show you a couple of them to show the way that this works. So you have music kin, which is someone who identifies with a specific song. So their identity could be a specific song or a song lyric, and that is their identity. Fiction kin is someone who identifies with characters in media on an integral or personal level. So examples that I read of are people who identify maybe like as Sonic the Hedgehog or as Bugs Bunny. Or another one is just sort of a category, so like an unnamed or an unclassified Pokemon character. It may not even be a real Pokemon character, but like in their mind, their identity would fit into that group of Pokemon. We have starseeds. Starseed is someone who identifies as a being from outer space. Starseeds have a list of non-earthen beings as past life possibilities. So they generally believe in reincarnation, and they think that they were born as a human from these other planets because they have a mission to fulfill here. Basically the idea, and this goes back in a lot of the Gnostic stuff we talked about last week, is that they feel different on the inside because they've already had an experience once before, at least once before, of that soul, but now the soul has changed the vessel, and so now they're here on this planet. Then we have plantkin, and that's a person who identifies as a plant. And then we'll round it out with draconic. That is someone who identifies as a dragon. Now, up until this point, these have been kind of silly. I think the people who are watching this can probably, I can just say that most of this just appears as a very silly thing that people might hold on to. But I did all of this because I want to show you a progression, because we're about to change to a different group of flags And this is where I'm going to say the vulnerable are at risk. And just so you know, these flags I'm showing you, there are a lot of variations. I think it's funny that people always say church people can't get along. Do your research into these communities and you'll find out who can't get along. Because you have a bunch of people who, I'm sorry, but are very narcissistic a lot of the time. And they all just think their way is the way. And there's no rules because there's no reality, so you'll find that they can't even agree on a flag to rally around. That happens in that LGBT community as well. And there's actually right now a real civil war between the LGBs and the TQs to the point that the LGBs are trying to liberate away from them. It's interesting to watch. I don't know if it's productive, but it's very interesting. These flags represent something very different than what was just an oddity on the last screen. I want to start with system. A system is, quote, a body in which two or more minds, alters, fragments, other conscious beings reside. Systems generally have a psychiatric diagnosis and they have severe trauma. So people who are systems generally are diagnosed with things like dissociative identity disorder. What they just described about having several minds, we used to call that split personalities. The disorders in this group are generally people who have been through a severe real trauma. And what happens is that, for instance, if a child is severely and just in an awful way abused, and it's something that happens often, their defense mechanism begins to put their mind somewhere else. The only way to get through it, to survive it, is to mentally go somewhere else so that they can just get through whatever's happening to them. But what happens over time is that those become different personalities for that person. Again, we don't use multiple personality anymore. We don't say split personality anymore. It's dissociative because they're these compartmentalized things that are dissociated or separated from their body. It's a very rare diagnosis. But people who have those diagnoses have now all rallied and started calling themselves systems. So just so you're aware, for instance, if I identified as a system, I may have 5 minds or alters. Those would be my systems. And I would say, well, I conferred with my systems and this is what we came up with. My systems designed this. My systems listened to this, but they didn't all agree about how to do it. And I'm talking about me that entire time. Again, we could go back to our conversations before about transgenderism. Can you see why I'm very adamantly against saying they to people as a pronoun? Because we're getting into people, do you see what's actually happened here? And what we're actually addressing if someone says I am they, that should be the biggest red flag for Christians, that it's time to get it together and figure out what's really happening here. So basically what you have is this very vulnerable population of people who have already been traumatized in their life. And I mean true deep trauma. People who already have psych disorders, and they're now being rallied together. What's interesting about this flag is that each stripe represents people who are systems, but in different stages of their life. So there's one stripe is for those who don't know they're a system yet. Yeah, but we'll be happy to let you know what it is. Others who I think are basically getting their footing in that community or in the community. But the other stripe is interesting because it is for people who no longer have systems. So people who have gotten psychiatric help, and if they're one of the ones who make it out, and are healed of that, and they no longer have systems or they no longer actively engage with their systems, they're on the flag too. Why? Because they have to keep you that the rest of your life. It is very common in the day we live in where people want to identify as their trauma or identify as a diagnosis. And that way they're stuck there forever. It's a great plan of the devil to make people be victims for the rest of their lives. And when I say that, that's not me being demeaning or saying stop being a victim and move on and get over what happened. I'm not saying that, because they're talking about people who have actively worked to move forward in their life from their trauma, and these people are saying, no, stay back here with us, make sure you stay under this banner with us. It's manipulative of these people who don't want to feel that way anymore and they want to be free. Headmate. This is a being residing within someone's mind, capable of their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. This can appear through trauma, tulpomancy, and spiritual origins. That spiritual origins, I guess it depends on your experience. But if you're somebody who's been raised in church, particularly probably Pentecostal churches, and you start hearing about a person who has another voice in their mind that has its own thoughts, its own feelings, its own desires, and trying to put that on you, we would call that demonic. Other people in the class said that, they saw the psychological aspect of it, and that's fair as well. But I want to focus here on this tulpomancy. That is really important in this conversation, especially for young people. Tulpomancy involves meditation, a meditation process that, in the TED Talk that I watched at least, they said that tulpomancy allows you to basically manifest an imaginary friend. So like a child might have an imaginary friend, an adult who engages in tulpomancy will do guided meditations because that other entity is already in their mind, but through meditation, you can get it out of your mind and into the real world. So if you do tulpomancy, you can take this entity that you've got in your head that has its own will, its own personality, and you can now bring it into the real world so that you can physically see that tulpa in the physical realm. They report that they can hear it, that they can even touch it, or that they felt the tulpa touch them. Again, we would call that something very specific in spiritual circles. What was really interesting to me is that I started reading people's experiences with tulpas, and they would say things like that they played board games with a tulpa. Now, this is another one of those spots where I thought, are they just messing with us? Like, is this to make people like me look really dumb when we make these kind of videos, and people watch it, and people say, oh, look, she fell for it? I really started to wonder, and maybe some of that's true, but I do believe from the things I was reading that there are people who truly feel these are the experiences that they're having. And again, I go back to, even if they didn't, my worry is that these young people who are getting onto specifically Discord, if you've not heard about Discord, please, parents, understand what Discord is. I have never heard a story from a young person that ended well, that started on Discord. You may have heard about it in the news. The person's been arrested in the Charlie Kirk shooting. They said, the murder of Charlie Kirk. The young man that they arrested, they said he had been on Discord servers, which is like chat rooms used to be, having these conversations, and now everyone he was talking to are under investigation. So please, parents, pay attention to what your kids are doing and have these conversations that the people you find on the internet, you could end up having some responsibility or culpability in what's going on. But when I started to read these threads, I realized some of these people, some of them at least, very much believe this is true. And even if they didn't, if our kids are seeing that and our young people are seeing that and they believe that it's the truth, it's opening up a door. It is absolutely opening a door. I watched a TED Talk, which is a pretty official, that's not some fly-by-night organization. I watched a TED Talk about, and obviously they have TED Talks that are so immoral, but that's not my point. My point is that is presented as a very official speech of a young man who was talking about tulpomancy, and he was talking about these guided meditations that you can go on, and then even gave you some of the meditations that you can do. That's terrifying. Equally terrifying is that when I was reading these threads and these Reddits about people who said their tulpas have appeared in real life, there was something they all had in common. And what they all had in common is that they had been playing role-playing games, specifically Dungeons and Dragons. I have never, to my knowledge, I've been asked questions and I answer the best that I can. I don't have enough knowledge of those type of role-playing games to remark on them. I have read a lot about people who did engage in them, people who came out of the occult and they're exposing what they see in it. I have friends, I have church members who came out of the occult who kind of helped me understand the devil's playbook a little bit better, and all of them have told me that very strongly they oppose those type of role-playing games. In the games, it's a lot of casting spells and doing chants. Chants is enchanting, and from what I can tell from these conversations that I've had at least, it seems like it could really be a very rhythmic thing, which sort of lulls you, almost like a trance, I guess. Again, I've never played it. I could be wrong about that part, but that's what I'm hearing when they talk to me about it. And in those games, it's about killing and it's about control. And so things that I think are very concerning for young people to be gathered into. And also those games tend to gather sort of the outliers, the kids who probably don't fit in very much, and they all kind of gravitate together, which I think does end up leading them further down these roads of this really kind of out there stuff. A couple more identities. Deitykin. Someone who identifies as a recognized or unrecognized God, so someone who thinks they are a god. And God Shard, which is a person who considers themselves to be a smaller, independent part of a still existent God. So they may believe in Yahweh, God of the Bible, but they think they are a little God in comparison to him, but they're a deity. Curious if you see the problem of that, of going through society with people who think that they are God. Because if someone is God, rules won't apply to them. And I don't mean this like, I've worked for some doctors that thought they were God. That we say they have a God complex. No, these people literally think they're God. Well, if you literally think you're God, then you have the right to judge people according to your personal standard. You have the right to punish wickedness as you see it. That's scary. That's scary that we can land there when we started off with dressing up like an animal and playing around. And now here we are, and you can say, Lindsay, that was just such a jump. No, it wasn't. It was not a jump. It wasn't a jump at the point that reality started to go out the window. A couple more conversations or words I just want you to know about. A couple more words I want you to know about. Astral shifting. You may have heard of astral projection before. That's a spiritual term where someone can put their soul into another realm. Pretty common in the occult. Astral shifting is when someone has an out-of-body experience and they travel to another realm or spiritual plane as their kin type. So if I was a dragon kin, I keep bringing up dragons, hope nobody thinks that's my thing. That's one that's fascinated me. If I thought I was a dragon and I astral shifted, I would leave my body, my soul would leave my body, and I would go into a realm where there are dragons, and I would have that experience there. And there's feral shifting, and that is what causes an individual to act more like their kin type. Just listen. In many cases, the individuals report a total or near total loss of human self-awareness. So they totally lose touch that they're a person. And then this definition included this line. If the experience is frequent, it is recommended that you report to a local psychiatrist. But only if it's frequent. You've lost touch with reality, but you got to lose touch with reality a lot before we're going to call for help. Because if we're calling a psychiatrist every time someone acts these ways, then we can't use this line that this is my identity and it's okay. Well, it's not okay. It's not okay if I'm teaching, if I'm standing at my lectern and I'm teaching in this congregation and suddenly I say, I'm a wolf, I'm not a person at all. Why? Because people have intellect and we can be rational. We use our intellect to decide what we're going to do. Wolves go on instinct. So if I'm suddenly a wolf, I can look at somebody and jump across the pew and just start gnawing their face off because I don't have the intellect to stop me to understand why I can't do that. That is terrifying. That is terrifying. And it's the road that we're on when Christians decide the most loving thing to do is to just go along with what anybody else says because I don't want to hurt their feelings. I'm okay with hurting feelings if it means that nobody's going to get their face chewed off by someone who thinks they're a wolf in my congregation. I'm sorry. And I don't mean the metaphorical wolves. I mean, they really think they're wolves. This is terrifying to me, how we have just sat by and we're quiet or we're giggling or we're making jokes about this stuff, it's not funny. It's not funny that our kids are losing touch with reality. It's not funny that our kids are being discipled by the world. It's not funny that they're being affirmed in everything and the church is too scared to say anything about it. I want to close with this. In our discussion, a great comment was made by our youth leader. One of our kids was talking about people who walk on all fours, and that sometimes it is actually considered a sport or like an exercise. I think it was something like quadrilatex or something like that. Forgive me, I can't remember the exact word. But it's when someone walks on all fours, and they said, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's a person's identity or even that they're a furry. They may just enjoy doing that. And our youth pastor brought up a really great point, and he talked about when we were kids and like you'd be in gym class and you would do the bear crawl or you would do like a crab walk on your hands and on your feet. And he said, you know, the devil is really doing something here where our kids are being told that things that are a part of imagination, things that were part of play as a child are now being tainted and called something different. We saw that with the transgender conversation as well, where I told you, that suddenly the tomboys don't exist anymore. And when I said that, one of the kids kind of reacted in the room. I was like, no, they do. That's my point, but everybody acts like they don't. That suddenly if a little girl is rough and tumble, she must really be a boy. Or if a boy is raised by his mother and he's only around his mother and her friends, and so he begins to emulate them, he's labeled as effeminate and made to feel like that's who he is instead of doing what should be done, which is say, let's pull in some coaches, let's pull in some men in the church, let's pull in some masculine influence for this young man so he can see how to be a young man and see it modeled. Instead, we just labeled him with an identity and we just say, well, this is what it is and we can do nothing about it. And our youth leader was making such a great point there. We need to be engaged, especially with our young people. We need to talk to them. We need to be affirming God's word in them and who they are and their identity. And we need to listen to them about the experiences that they're having, not affirming all of them, not affirming the things that kids are saying to them at school, but we need to be the one who's standing there as gently as we can until we have to be a little bit more stern about it, pressing back against this agenda that is taking these things and turning it into something it should not be. It is normal for small children to play like they are animals, and it is normal for them to have a time of where we're using our imaginations those ways. And then there becomes a time for discipline and focus. And now we're going to learn how to put our attention over here, and we can play again another time, but having very clear lines between play and even when you're playing, you should understand that play is play and it's not reality. When he said that, I thought about the scripture that says, do not let your good be evil spoken of. Who's going to do that for these kids? Who's going to be the one who speaks up and who says, these are the lines between identity and imagination? Who's going to be the one who stands up and says, this thing that you're doing over here, we're going to talk about it because we will not stand silently as it escalates into something else. I'm not going to stand silently as you engage with that to the degree that then it becomes an identity or a question of identity or that you get further and further into this. The church has to be the watchman on the wall. We have to pay attention. We have to be their support. We need to know how to stand against it. And as a preview for what's coming in the next class, here's how we're going to stand against it. Next week, we're going to talk about that body-soul unity. We're going to talk about the fact that God made us as a physical body, but also the soul that is on the inside of us. That the physical body is important too. It is not evil, and it is not inconsistent with our soul. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the importance of creation. We're going to talk about how when God speaks about the creation, God does the creation of man and the way the Bible works, even the grammar of the first couple of chapters of Genesis tells us that God does not see humans the way that he sees animals. He sees us very different. We're going to talk about the difference between souls of people and animals, and we're going to talk about the value that has been placed on you as a person. All that's coming next week. I hope you come back, and I hope this has been enlightening for you. I have enjoyed sharing this with you. I enjoy You know I love apologetics. If you've been watching any time, you know this is my passion, and we're going to continue moving forward. In the next few weeks, after we share the conclusion here, we're also going to get into the subjects of premarital sex and pornography. I think we're going to go into polygamy soon and talk about that as well. And then we're going to do some more cultural topics. And eventually we're going to get to conversation about books of the Bible and why certain ones are excluded. So I hope you'll come back for those. Again, I'm Lindsay Schreiber. Thank you for joining me for little notes on big questions. Like and subscribe for more content. I'll see you soon.